And we're back, gang! Or if this is your first time with us, welcome! Here we are in Season 5, and it's crazy how far we've come. By the end of this season, we will have reviewed 99 episodes of American Dad. As such, at the end of this episode, I'll be going a little bit more in depth than what we've seen over the quote-unquote last 100 episodes. All in all, Season 3 and Season 4 were incredibly high quality and a very steady beat of quality. But Season 5, while it does have some very strong episodes, even what I like to call the Great Roger Trilogy, there is a bit of a notable dip in quality in some of the episodes as well. It's not really as bad as we get later on into the later seasons, but it is noticeable. So what works with this season? What fails? And what kind of Rogers are we going to see? There's only one way to find out, so here we are, going live with Season 5. In Country Club. Our A story follows Steve being tasked with singing the national anthem. However, naturally, Stan has to hold him to a higher standard and is super critical of his performance and decides to personally train him. As he trains him, he realizes that Steve will only be able to perform the anthem if he experiences real war. And so Stan takes Steve to a golf course where they reenact the Vietnam War. Season 5 is definitely where we see our first proper absurdist bit in American Dad. We've seen it in seasons prior, but Season 5 really turns up that absurdity. We go away from, again, the political discourse that we've still seen and the mentions of it, just to go, as, pardon the expression, balls to the wall with episodes going forward. We're gonna get a much more violent season and a much more graphic series going forward. Steve has his own squad, including Dick and Buckle, and ultimately falls asleep, leaving his camp vulnerable to the Viet Cong, and Stan is eventually taken hostage. The B story follows Roger obsessing over a pay-per-view show where Barbra Streisand performs Celine Dion and has Francine prepare a dish with a small bird that you have to eat under a napkin so you hide your shame from God. However, Stan won't give Roger the code to order the pay-per-view, so he has to go into the Vietnam reenactment and torture Stan until he gives him the code. And while I know I've talked about this in the past, it is very interesting to see, especially in this season, where the A story and the B story often intersect in a lot of ways, and American Dad has done this since Season 1, as early as, say, finances with wolves. But what we're seeing here is actually an evolution of that idea, and something that not a ton of series do. Usually, the A and B stories are just ways to have characters doing whatever they want. However, in American Dad, they like to intersect them several times. Now, of course, there are still going to be those standalone B stories, but it's just really fascinating that here we have Roger, both in the A story, interacting with them in this Vietnam reenactment, and has his own B story where he has his own personal goals for why he's doing it. It's just a really, really neat touch. Steve then develops PTSD from the fake war and tries to go back to the battlefield, but ultimately is able to face his fears and perform the national anthem. However, while he's in the hospital, we get our first introduction to Mind Quad and Mindhunter, played by the incredible Robert Patrick. I just love In Country Club, and seeing Roger consume a godforsaken dish and the just trippy CG 3D effect is just so surreal, and yet so peak American Dad for where we're heading with the series. It may be bold to say, but In Country Club is a solid 10 out of 10 to kick off the season, and one of the best episodes of the entire Fox era. The episode begins with Stan telling Steve that friendship is only worth what you get out of it, so long as you're getting something in return, and proceeds to blow off Roger for a spray tan hangout, and then sends Roger to pick up stamps instead. Haley says that it's wrong he doesn't just hang out with Roger, to which Stan says Roger mooches off of him all the time and that he doesn't need to hang out with him. And honestly, given how Roger has treated the family in the past, even torturing Stan in just the last episode with a Sex and the City movie script, he's kinda got a point. Like, I know there's a moral lesson to be learned, but I really don't think Stan is in the wrong for blowing Roger off here or there. Like, it's just Roger has consistently been this horrible person to the family, and it's reasonable for him to think this. Anyway, at work, Stan is given the task of making sure General Pequeño signs the oil deal with the CIA after he plans on taking him to the mall. If all goes well, he'll get his own helicopter, or as Da Vinci called it, an aerial screw. The B story. Oh my god. Okay. Full disclosure, might be one of the worst B stories in the entire series. The B story involves Francine thinking Snot is drowning and diving in to save him, which unintentionally allows Snot to touch Boob, and Steve is determined to get even. It's a weird B story, and I'm not really sure. It's not good. I was gonna say, I'm not even sure if I would call it good. It's not good. There's just not anything to really talk about it, because it's not really there. It just drags the whole episode down. Ugh. Anyway, Stan goes out with General Pequeño, who is voiced by Ricardo Montalban, who you'd probably recognize as Khan from Star Trek II Wrath of Khan, or as the grandpa in the Spy Kids franchise. This would be one of his last roles before he passed. Fun fact, Family Guy's Mixed Stroke and American Dad's Moon over Isla Island are both two of his last acting credits. The general then abruptly chokes on a hot dog and dies before he can sign the treaty. However, Roger looks just like the general, and yeah, Stan tries to use Roger to forge the treaty. Roger decides to take being a dictator seriously, and eventually his people rebel, usurping him because they won't paint their children yellow again. I'm torn on this episode. On the one hand, it has a lot of really great sight gags and one-off jokes. On the other, it just kinda doesn't fit. Like, the B story is just awkward and is this weird bragging contest between the two, and I'd say it's our first just Snot and Steve side story, but also it's this? This is what we're talking about? It's trying to fondle each other's moms? Not to mention, Stan is wrong for viewing relationships as give and take, but also Roger is not the right character to use for that idea, because we have tons of examples when he's abused the family's kindness. I don't know. Personally, I like the episode, but critically, it just kind of feels like a miss. Moon over Isla Island is probably, honestly, like a 6 out of 10. The family is set to take a trip, and they're leaving Steve in charge of the house while they're gone. Steve decides to have his friends over, and that's when they discover a CIA drone controller and proceed to take the drone out for a drive, eventually crashing it and ruining Stan's trust in him. The B story is the family on the plane, as it can't get off the ground because either A, a drone flew over, or B, Roger is playing a young girl, and so when he asks for a drink, he's not provided one. This causes him to dress up as Stan so that he can get drunk. However, security believes there's a missing girl on the plane and refuses to let the plane take off. Stan eventually does walk off the plane and has refused to get back on, and he and Steve have to hunt down a drone that had been taken by the Chinese mafia. The two slowly begin to trust one another again and finally start to bond. I know I kind of speed ran home a drone, but that's because it's pretty cut and dry. That's not to say it's bad, I actually quite enjoy it, and would say that the episode overall is a solid 8 out of 10. Steve is a great character in the episode, and I don't know, they've gotten much better with how they write Steve's friends, and they feel much more fleshed out. Roger is great as just the character that you love to hate. Stan is always terrific, and there's just a lot of wonderful one-off jokes that just make it overall entertaining. It is kind of odd seeing this episode right after Moon over Isla Island, since it has Roger being the same selfish alien we're used to, which just throws the past episode completely out the window, but it just feels more on brand overall than Moon over Isla Island. You have, again, these really great bits with Francine, Haley, and Roger, but then you also have this juxtaposition of Stan and Steve having a really good heart-to-heart as they try and recover a CIA drone. I mean, even the end fight on the Chinese parade is amazing. I really enjoy Home a Drone, and I think you should give it a fair chance. I know I talked about it briefly in Country Club earlier on in the season, but this episode really encapsulates that idea that the B story and the A story are going to constantly intersect in some episodes, because there's always the consequences of the A story impacting the B story of Francine, Haley, and Roger on the plane. If the drone flies over, the plane can't take off, and we keep seeing those instances over and over and over again, which is a very nice touch. It's summer vacation! Steve and the gang are off for camp when they run into Clyde Templeton, played by the brilliant Clancy Brown, who sells them basically Speedos to parade around camp in. Stan, however, after hearing horror stories at work of wives getting bored with their husbands when the kids are away and leaving them, begins to fear losing Francine. He uses Roger as a buffer until Roger decides to move out and become more independent. This is when he starts to drug Roger to make him too sick to live on his own, eventually leading Stan and Francine to entering Roger's mind, and Francine finding out what he really fears. It's a good episode. We get to see again Stan and Francine bonding and seeing how strong their relationship is, while also getting a lot of great little Roger skits, including him being responsible for Biggie Smalls getting shot. Steve and his friends are gullible, and this won't even be the last time they buy something from a trench coat wearing salesman, but it really solidifies them as just grade A losers, and I love how triumphant they are in it. They're just so confident that they're gonna be cool, and then they're not, and it's just handled really, really well. Brains, and Automobiles is a 8 out of 10 that never really outstays its welcome. It's got a lot to love. Again, it's just Stan's insecurities getting the best of him and Francine still being super reassuring, but it's handled really, really well. Again, we have this really grounded idea of Stan's insecurities coupled with a CIA machine that allows them to go into an alien's mind, and that's how we get our resolution. It's still handled incredibly sweetly, and Francine genuinely loves Stan, and you get to see how they interact, and it's just really baffling to me that this is again called the most nihilistic of the McFarlane cartoons when you compare it to, again, Peter and Lois that couldn't have an episode like this because it's set in the canon that they've hated each other. It's just, it doesn't make sense for it. Stan and Francine may fight, sometimes even frequently, but deep down you can tell that they love one another, and the fact that Stan doesn't want to be boring to her and lose her because of it is really touching. Stan demands that Steve grow up and that Steve shouldn't have a kid's birthday party anymore. Stan attributes this to having to grow up when he was Steve's age due to Jack leaving him and his mom and leaving him in the man of the house position. However, Francine decides to get Steve a moon bounce for his birthday, and when they all seem to enjoy it and Stan goes to stop the fun, he ends up bouncing for days, realizing he's never properly let his inner child out. This is also our first appearance of Dr. Penguin, Roger's therapist character, who will be coming back regularly. He sells his car, starts hanging out with Steve and his friends, and when he TPs a house, gets sent to jail where he continues to have fun and refuses to leave, leaving Steve to grow up and become the man of the house in his stead. The B story is Haley giving Klaus a haircut, because he misses the sensation, and upon giving him a horrible haircut, he proceeds to try and drown her. This episode is phenomenal. It has a deeper emotional core than a lot of the other episodes in the season, and it genuinely feels like a heartfelt Stan and Steve episode. You feel bad for Stan, and you understand where he's coming from. It's not so much him bullying Steve, as we'll get into in later episodes, or even in earlier episodes that we've seen. It's genuinely Steve loving his dad and not wanting to take this from him, and Stan realizing that it's unfair of him to do this to his own son. And at the end of it, they seem to understand each other more, and it really just, it works. Plus, the Klaus B story is just great. I had forgotten about it before my rewatch, but D. Bradley Baker has really hammered home Klaus as a character, and I genuinely think the Haley and Klaus stories are some of the best, even going all the way back to It's Good to Be the Queen back in season 1. Their interactions have always just seemed the most genuine, and Man in the Moon Bounce is just a solid 10 out of 10. Ugh. Shallow vows. I've been trying to say vows like 5 times. I keep saying vowels. Anyway, look, 4 out of 10. Skip it. It's honestly been a minute since I've said that about an episode, but Shallow Vows is just, yeah, it's not great. Francine decides to let herself go to see if Stan would love her if she didn't put all the work into her appearance. He's horrified by what he sees, and so he blinds himself to be with her. It's sweet till they realize that they should just go back to how they were and bury all of this and ignore it. All while their ceremonies are planned by Jeannie Gold, which is just Roger, who apparently has 2 grown human sons. The B story is Steve and Haley getting a gift for their parents, and when it's not good enough, they are hunted down by Roger in an assassin persona. And admittedly, Roger is the funniest part of this and most episodes, but even then, it doesn't work on so many levels. It's just unnecessary and unnecessarily mean for the sake of being mean. I guess it did give us some of that Franny Fanny, but then like, what else? What else does this episode do? I love this show. This show is one of my favorites of all time, and I can't come up with anything redeeming about Shallow Vows except the most superficial elements. I mean, when we get to the TBS era, we'll see a lot of experiments and wild ideas, but this episode just doesn't feel experimental. It just feels inherently mean and empty. It just doesn't work, and I'm really just not going to defend it because it doesn't deserve the defense. It's not as bad as Deacon Stan Jesus Man, because I'd at least rewatch it again. It's definitely not good either. Stan is emotionally stunted again. All he expresses is anger and decides to stay up and wait for Haley to get home, and she refuses to stop going to concerts and tells Stan that My Morning Jacket is great, which is actually a callback to a previous episode where they mentioned them. Francine gets Haley's ticket back for her and encourages her to keep her rebellious spirit. When Haley goes to the concert, Stan goes to get her back, and when his earplugs are pulled out and he hears My Morning Jacket for the first time, he falls in love with the band to an obsessive degree, even going so far as buying a deep cut album from Norman, who is played by Zach Galifianakis. My Morning Jacket obviously has a cameo appearance in the episode, and basically, Stan won't go back to normal until he gets backstage, and so Francine helps him get backstage with her old rock and roll party skills, and he's able to go and meet the band. It's a fine episode. It has its charms with Francine helping Stan out and encouraging him to let loose, but it really doesn't go deeper than that. It's like a 6 or 7 out of 10 that's just very middle of the road, and I think a lot of that is because it doesn't have a B story. It's just one constant story that honestly could have used that cutaway or two to really break the story up and make it feel just a little bit more natural. It's not bad, it's just not great. Though I will say it is nice seeing this as a breakup of just musical band is guest star in episode. They actually integrate it into the show itself, and we will actually see that a couple more times as the show goes on, even one coming up with a Jeff-centric episode. You know the one I'm talking about. We all like Wax Fang, and we all know why. Haley decides that she wants to start a business and refuses to listen to Stan on what he thinks would be a good idea. Stan has to blow money for the CIA at a strip club where he meets a stripper named Tangeray and is determined to change her life to prove Haley wrong, and he does know what he's talking about. The B story is Steve trapped at space camp where he thought it would be a ton of high-octane action, but is instead just a bunch of boring lectures, so he and his friends plan a breakout, Shawshank Redemption style. Ultimately, Stan starts a dry cleaning company, it goes under, and he begins stripping to make money. And you've seen the episode before. It doesn't really reinvent the wheel or anything. The Steve B story isn't even funny enough to really keep the rest of the episode afloat, and it just kind of stagnates. It's a middle of the ground 5, 6 out of 10. That being said, it's important to note that even as the scores may drop for some episodes, there's still a higher quality overall than the seasons before it. If anything, the longer the series goes on, the more critical you have to be. How do you justify a series going on for over 17 years? And largely, the series as a whole does still hold up, but G-String Circus just isn't it. It's okay, but it's definitely not a beacon of what the show can be at its funniest, which is just a genuine shame. It's our first new Christmas special since season 3! Stan and Francine get frisky in church, and when they get out of the closet, the rapture happens. With only sinners left on Earth, Stan begins to resent Francine for holding him back from being raptured, and she begins to see Jesus as he prepares for the post-apocalypse. Time passes and Jesus is on a mission to unalive the Antichrist, and begins his trek to the UN building when he encounters a battle-torn Stan, who reluctantly agrees to help when he hears that the Antichrist has Francine. That's right, it's a Christmas episode that's all about the Antichrist and the Rapture. We're a season away from probably the most iconic Christmas narrative American Dad would run with, but Rapture's Delight is just terrific, and a great send-off to the What If Christmas specials for a while. They will revisit it with what could be called a pseudo-prequel, but it's still kinda something that they leave in the past. They'll come back to it eventually, but they go out with a solid 8 out of 10. It really just works on every level and even has the return of the angel Stan helped get her wings back in the most adequate Christmas ever episode when she gives him his dream heaven after blowing up at the UN. Will Forte actually plays Jesus in the episode, and Andy Samberg plays Antichrist, and it really just goes to show how great the voiceover talent is for the show. The family is cutting back and Francine wants Stan to sell the SUV and get a hybrid, so Stan swears he'll find a way to make some extra money. B's story follows Steve and the boys deciding to help Tuttle for some extra side money. However, they discover that Tuttle has become a shut-in and immobily fat after his wife died. They begin helping out around his house while Stan goes to the track to bet on horses, only to find out Roger is a jockey. Roger tries to convince Stan to buy the horse since he knows it can win the Derby in a week. They start to struggle with the horse and eventually Stan puts his brain in the horse to hopefully be able to win the race, all while Snot gets crushed under Tuttle's weight trying to get the $100 from his back pocket. Stan and Roger go on to win the race and yeah, that's it. It just kinda ends. It's like a 4 or a 5 out of 10 that just feels like padding. It feels like an episode taken from the writing room floor and just sort of juiced together into a 22-minute runtime. It does nothing. It is the null rod of American Dad episodes. Skip it and just don't look back. Oh, I genuinely, I wrote my script and now I'm recording and I forgot about this episode. I legitimately forgot that this episode came after Shallow Vows. But A Jones for a Smith opens with Stan hating social programs. Big shocker. Roger is shown abusing the programs, which causes Stan to get angry and talk about what a crutch they are. It's a weirdly political episode, and I think that's partly why this episode just does not work. It feels so out of place compared to everything else. Steve gets a girlfriend and he's absolutely ecstatic about it, but when Stan has a cold that he's been trying to fight and Francine goes to brunch with Greg and Terry, she gets pulled over in her neighborhood for drunk driving and ends up working community service because Stan refuses to get her out of jail, where she then eventually goes to help the homeless at a soup kitchen. Stan, believing that anything Francine makes is his, takes the soup from the soup kitchen to combat his cold, though while outside he meets a shady dealer who gives him something to help his cold, and yeah, it's crack. Stan gets addicted to crack. Steve gets the blessing of Janine's father to be intimate with her if he can meet with Steve's parents, who one is freshly addicted to crack, and yeah, this is not a good episode. It might be on par with a season 1 episode, honestly. It's hollow and horrid. The jokes don't land, the elements feel stressed, and there's nothing to latch onto, which is such a shame because Janine's dad is voiced by Bryan Cranston, who is back for yet another episode, and it's just disappointing to see it wasted on this of all things. A Jones for a Smith is a 2 out of 10, and not worth watching. It's Valentine's Day in Langley Falls, and as Stan and Francine are celebrating, they're intercepted by a robotic Stan from the future who has come back under the guise of training Stan for the robot uprising. However, he is really here to seduce Francine and take her from him. The B story has Steve and the gang finding a real doll in Toshi's parents' bedroom. It's a sweet episode where Stan realizes he doesn't want to be a machine, he wants to grow old with Francine, but also, there's not much else going on. Stan fights Robo-Stan at Hershey Park, and that's really the only memorable part of the entire episode. Anything is better than a Jones for a Smith, so this episode seems infinitely better by comparison, but it's still just kinda there. There's really only one other bad episode in this season after this one, and it's not even all that bad. It's like a 6 out of 10 to its credit and doesn't outstay its welcome. It's got some good jokes, some more meta comedy than most episodes, and all in all is a fine palate cleanser if nothing else. It's just weird that there's been such a dip in quality right in the middle of the season. But as we turn the corner and enter the home stretch of season 5, we have some terrific American Dad to enjoy. Alright, we're here. This is what I call the Great Roger Trilogy. 3 episodes, one after another, that are easily some of the strongest Roger has ever been, and we start with Return of the Bling. Stan mocks Steve for not having real heroes and proceeds to show him a real hero, the Miracle on Ice hockey team. That's when Roger reveals he played on that very team, and Stan begins to idolize him once he realizes he was telling him the truth. However, when he finds out that Roger was on steroids, he's determined to make him give his medal back, and so they travel to the Olympic headquarters, Lord of the Rings style, to return the bling. The B story is actually the start of an ongoing plot, wildly enough. Haley and Reggie begin to start to catch feelings for each other and start growing closer thanks to a Shaggy concert. Or Shuggy. I actually really like this little mini arc, and it works well for both of the characters. Reggie used to be a human, and he and Haley just generally have a lot in common and build off one another really well. It's not like, say, Brian dating a human girl in Family Guy, where they play it as normal, but you can't really shake that there's something off about it. Here it feels much more natural. I'm talking more about the B story than the A story, not because it's more interesting, but because it's something built on later. That's not to say that the A story is bad at all. It's honestly phenomenal, and it's very much a Stan, Steve, and Roger episode, and I think that's what makes it work so well. There's so many great one-off jokes with the hostel, and how the airplane trip, the conference. Return of the Bling is very much a return to form and a 10 out of 10 episode by and large. Maybe I feel that way because it comes right after May the Best Stan Win and Jones for a Smith, but I don't care. It hits all the notes, it has great jokes, and the characterization is on point every step of the way. Cops and Roger is the second episode in our pseudo-self-proclaimed trilogy, and it's all about Roger joining the police force after he and Francine get mugged, and Stan accuses him of not being strong. Roger begs Stan to train him to be good enough to be on the force, and as soon as he joins the force, he immediately turns into a bad cop with the help of his new detective partner, played by Bobby Cannavale of Boardwalk Empire, and I mean, you've seen him in other things. The B story continues the will they won't they romance between Haley and Reggie, where they go on a double date and eventually both dump their partners. Like, obviously Stan has to turn around and help Roger out of the mess he's made for himself, and then credits roll, but Cops and Roger is just another banger of an episode. It has a ton of great jokes, it builds off the characters and relationships, and it just feels so whole. These 3 episodes really are quintessential American Dad. Each one brings a different element that works better than the last. Return of the Bling has Stan, Steve, and Roger traveling around the world and is a more global view. Cops and Roger is all about how they interact with the police, and Roger acclimating to a new environment is much more a local view, and Merlot Down Dirty Shame, the next episode we'll talk about, is an interpersonal view as it focuses on the relationships between the family members. The scope may shrink, but the quality is maintained through yet another 10 out of 10 episode. Merlot Down Dirty Shame opens with Stan and Roger trapped in an elevator and bonding as they work to keep each other calm, and even get matching necklaces to show off that they're now best friends forever. Francine is preparing for a trip to Napa, and Stan says he can't make it, but that Roger should go in his place, and the two are determined to have a good time without Stan. The B story finds Steve being able to lucid dream every time he sees a red ball in his dreams. When he's a jerk to Haley and Klaus, they decide to mess with him and bounce a red ball when he's awake to make him think he's in a dreamland, and he goes mad with power. Meanwhile, Francine and Roger get super drunk on their wine tour and eventually kiss at the end of the evening, causing Roger to freak out and try and bury the news, which gets significantly harder when Stan makes a surprise grand romantic gesture and joins the two on their trip. The best part about this episode is Roger's meltdown and how he just can't own up to anything. He is willing to bury Stan and Francine alive rather than face the consequences for his actions, and it's just peak Roger. The whole episode has some just really great story elements. There's some cringe-in parts, but it actually works on a meta-comedy level, and I feel the story lives or dies by how you feel about Mia, played by Angela Kinsey of The Office fame. If you like her character, you're probably going to hate Roger more, and that makes the episode as a whole better and work. And if you don't, it'll probably be a little middle ground to you. The B story concludes how only it can, and I mean, these last 3 episodes have been so bizarre and out there that they just work so perfectly well as American Dad episodes. They found that perfect line where you can hate Roger and yet still kinda cheer him on. He's not irredeemable, but he's on brand. He's never deviated from what he is, and they figured out how to make such a lovable jerk work so well. Merlot Down Dirty Shame is a 9 out of 10. Stan thinks Steve is too weak and gives up too easily. When it doesn't seem like he's making any progress, Stan does the only thing he knows will work. He disguises himself and bullies and beats up his own son. Meanwhile, Roger is trying to become a crime scene photographer, which is a very loose C story that just kind of lingers along the A story and the B story, and the B story is actually the conclusion of the Haley and Reggie story. The two begin to date, but when they're at the carnival, Haley runs into Jeff and walks off, leaving Reggie as they go to catch up. It's sad, you feel for Reggie, and it isn't ideal, but deep down you get it. He's Jeff, and we're in too deep now with him to ever properly get rid of him. Which is a little foreshadowing, but you probably know why. The A story continues when Francine finds out Stan is Steve's bully and starts training Steve how to fight him. There's also a werewolf sub-joke that keeps popping up, and I cannot understate how incredible it is. It's seriously the funniest joke of the entire season, in no small part thanks to Kevin Michael Richardson's performance as Principal Lewis. The thing that makes this episode so great is that Steve is shown to be weak, but not without resources, and the way he handles his problems, his way, is actually incredibly commendable. The episode as a whole works really brilliantly, and it's just another great example of the modern approach to American Dad. There's not cutaway gags, but there's bizarre things happening in Langley. We've seen them start to build more and more on just the everyday absurdity, and I think that's what makes this episode work so well. Everyone is in on the joke. Everyone is a part of the joke. Bully for Steve is another 10 out of 10. If you like An Incident at Owl Creek, I respect you. If you don't like the episode, you are validated. I'm not a huge fan of it either. An Incident at Owl Creek is an American Dad reinterpretation of the story of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Buckle and Shari are moving to the neighborhood and doing a pool party, so Stan sets up a fashion show to make sure the family knows how to keep the party from imploding. At the party, he tries to distract from Roger saying a racist joke by doing a cannonball, but his stomach starts to act up and yeah, he caddyshacks. Everyone laughs and he's ashamed. The family tries to run away from the shame, and you get a whole episode of them escaping it only to be pulled back in by Barack Obama, who begins to chant cannonball, and Stan opens his eyes to see he's still on the diving board, still getting ready to jump. Yeah, it's literally just a reimagining of a short story and could feel like a cop-out to a lot of people. And it's not that I don't like experimental American Dad episodes. If you can't tell by how enthusiastically I talk about them, I'm actually a very big fan. It's just, An Incident at Owl Creek compared to An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge just feels so drastically different. Where An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is about a Civil War soldier going to an execution, An Incident at Owl Creek is about Stan diving off of a diving board, and it just doesn't carry that same weight. There are a lot of really good experimental episodes that I'm excited to talk about, especially things like Rabbit Ears or Gold Top Nuts. But An Incident at Owl Creek, I do applaud for being creative. It just doesn't go that extra mile to make itself iconic. It's why I give it a 6 or a 7 out of 10, because it does at least try and do something different. It's skippable in my eyes and is just okay, maybe like it also, I believe, might be the last appearance of the Mamaris. I could be wrong on that, but I do believe they get 100, but we'll have to see. It's Roger's 1601st birthday, which I have to just take a minute and applaud American Dad for staying consistent and remembering character ages, even if it's something absurd like 1600. But with Roger's birthday, he decides that he wants to celebrate it with a good old-fashioned comedy roast. He gets the whole family together for the roast, and they proceed to send good-natured jabs his way. However, Roger can't take the jokes and proceeds to start crying, determined to get his life back on track after the family's harsh jabbing. The family tries to reassure him they were just in good fun, but soon after, weird occurrences start happening where the family's lives are thrown in peril. Roger has started to hunt them down for his ultimate revenge scheme. Stan gets Roger sent to an underwater prison in Asia, but when he breaks out, proceeds to take the family up into the Chia space station where they can hide out. But Roger manages to sneak onto the station with them, hunting each one down Alien style. Alien the movie, not Alien like what Roger is. Don't Don't worry, we're almost done. Eventually, he gets the family together and makes them roast each other or face his wrath, and they do, while making each other laugh with how savage they are, because it's again a roast and that's what you're supposed to do. This episode is a perfect capstone to an overall remarkable season. The jokes are great, the family feels connected, and it's just a very solid season finale. It's a 10 out of 10 that ages super well and keeps coming back for more. There's a scene where they change the CIA to the Central Human Intelligence Agency, and a robot agent named Frank throws his badge and storms off, and I still think about that. Like, again, the world is wild, and because it's not trapped in a cutaway gag that'll just be left, these wild elements help the world breathe and become a character all its own. Great Space Roaster is great and should be a part of any American Dad watch through, and is honestly probably one of the most solid season finales the show has ever had. And there we have it, that's season 5, and with that we have talked about 99 episodes of American Dad. I know the 100th episode is at the start of the next season, so I just want to take a minute and talk about how far we've come. Remember back in the first season when threat levels were mentioned, or home insecurity where Stan trapped the Mamaris in his backyard because he thought they were trying to blow up the neighborhood? Look at how far we've come from that in just 4 simple seasons. American Dad has pivoted so hard from its initial formula, and it's still evolving in season 5 into the show that we know today. Obviously, there will be a big transition when we go from the Fox to the TBS eras, but 99 episodes in, American Dad has come leaps and bounds, and I think that's something to celebrate. We've seen huge celebrity guest stars as recurring characters, the Smith family growing more and more complex, the world around them growing more and more absurd to match their daily antics, and through it all, the jokes have gotten progressively sharper and sharper. We have 4 more seasons before the jump to TBS, and come season 6, we'll be looking at American Dad post the 100 episode landmark. I know no one will really care about this, but I think it's important to talk about American Dad through a critical lens. It's the 3rd longest running animated comedy of all time, 4th if you want to argue South Park is 3rd just due to a number of episodes and first episode release dates and whatnot, but not many shows hit the milestones that American Dad has. We've seen it nominated for a GLAAD award, and we've seen all the voice actors come into their own, bringing these timeless characters to life. We should appreciate what American Dad has done because it's a part of the culture of American media, and its success is a reflection on how comedy has evolved through the years, and how instead of sticking to one formula, the writers have been allowed to evolve with it. We still have so many more quality episodes to go over, but I just want to thank you all for being with me as we continue our journey through one of my favorite shows of all time. Admittedly, this season I have gone a little bit more off script. Let me know if you can tell. But I really love this show, and I genuinely cannot thank you all enough for tuning in to each of these season reviews, and I know I'm gonna eventually put out a big Fox review episode, but genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, all of your kind words, all of your comments mean the absolute world to me. So what episodes did you like? What episodes did you hate? Think I was wrong about any episodes? Let me know in the comments below. And if you liked what you saw, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends we're out here. We also have a Patreon, Discord, and Twitch that you can join and follow if you're ever interested. I've been the Anime Academic. This has been Season 5. Now it's time for me to take a dive. But don't you start kicking bricks, because I'll see you all next time with Season 6.